She waited 3 days at the station, until the child in the oversized boots asked, "Will you marry my pa?" Dustmere, Wyoming, spring of 1874. The wind blew down from the barren hills, rattling the signs of Dustmere's lone train station. It was a single-room shack, with a bench too short for sleeping and a stove too rusted for warmth. Inside, Barbara Hart clutched a folded paper that had once promised a new life. "Are you certain?" she asked the station master. "There is no Ezra Whitlow in this town." The old man scratched his chin. "Been here 30 years. No Whitlows. Never have been." "But I received a letter. He said he had a ranch near the foothills." "That would be news to me. Are you sure it was Dustmere?" She held out the envelope. There it was again. Ezra Whitlow, Dustmere, Wyoming territory. The agency postmark looked real. It had all felt so real. Now, it had vanished like smoke. "You should wait inside," the man said gently. "The nights get cold." She went out and sat on the bench. That was the first day. On the second day, she ate the last of her stale bread. Her travel bag became a pillow. The townspeople passed by, whispering. A few offered biscuits. Most just stared. Near the well, she overheard one say, "Another one. The third girl this year. Poor thing looks hopeful, too." She chewed on a dry crust, too proud to cry. On the third morning, the station master brought her tea. "No word?" she asked. He shook his head. "Starting to think Ezra never existed," he said. "Some boys around here like to cause trouble. Wouldn't put it past them to forge a mail-order bride letter." She clutched her bag tighter. "Happened twice last fall. Those girls left on the next train out." Barbara looked to the hills, where hope had lived. She stood, brushing down her skirt. "When is the next train east?" "Day after tomorrow." She nodded. "Then I'll wait a little longer. But not for Ezra." "You don't deserve this," he said. She gave a faint smile. "Most people don't get what they deserve." She drank her tea. That afternoon, as she stood by the fence, a tug on her skirt startled her. She looked down to see a little girl, 5 years old at most. Boots too big, dust in her braids, eyes like stone. "Are you the lady who got left behind?" the girl asked. "I'm sorry?" "You have the sad face bag. That's what Ma used to say." Barbara almost laughed. "Yes, but I think I'm done being that lady now." The girl tilted her head. "Will you marry my pa?" Barbara froze. What?" "He lives over there. He needs someone." "I think you're a someone." Before Barbara could speak, the girl grabbed her hand. "Come on, I'm not supposed to be in town alone. It's better if you come with me." "Who is your father?" "Thomas Callahan. He says he doesn't need a wife, but maybe nobody's ever asked him right." Barbara hesitated, then followed. After 3 days on a bench, after losing everything and the little hope she had left, a child's hand was the first warmth she had felt in a long time. They reached the ranch at sunset, a sturdy house with faded paint, a leaning barn, 2 horses watching from the corral. A man stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. Broad shoulders, dark eyes, a face that looked carved from stone. Maisie ran ahead. "Pa, I brought someone." He looked at Barbara, then at his daughter. His expression didn't change. "I didn't ask for a wife," he said flatly. Barbara clutched her bag but lifted her chin. Then perhaps someone else sent me to find you. She glanced at Maisie, and for a moment, something in Thomas Callahan's stone face fractured. Not enough to be a smile, but enough to see the man was still learning how to feel. Barbara Hart had every intention of leaving at dawn. She'd stayed awake most of the night on the cot Thomas Callahan had grudgingly offered her. The frame was hard, the blanket thin, the silence loud enough to ring in her ears. Her bag was packed before sunrise, her boots laced, her mind braced for one more rejection. But as she stepped into the hall, she heard a cough, a soft, wheezing sound. Then a small, reedy voice, pitiful and hoarse. "Miss Barbara?" Maisie was sitting up, huddled in her doorway, cheeks flushed, eyes watery, her boots nowhere in sight. Barbara knelt. "You should be in bed," she whispered, touching the girl's forehead. "You're burning up." "I feel bad," Maisie whimpered, trying not to cry. Barbara glanced toward the kitchen. No sign of Thomas. She awkwardly lifted Maisie and carried her back to bed. She'd never held a child before, but Maisie clung to her shirt without hesitation. Thomas appeared then, drawn by the coughing. He stood in the doorway, his jaw tight. "She's sick?" he asked, his voice clipped. Barbara nodded. A low fever, but a real one. He crossed the room in 2 strides and leaned over the bed. Maisie reached for Barbara again. Thomas noticed. "She wants you," he stated. "She never takes to strangers." Barbara smoothed the blanket. "Then perhaps I'll stay, just until she's better." Thomas hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "There's water and broth in the pantry, if you know what you're doing." "I was a teacher," she replied, "not a nurse." He turned and left. That set the tone. Barbara stayed, not for him, but for the child who curled against her each night, murmuring sleepy nonsense. By day, she swept the floors, fetched water, and helped feed the stock, nearly tripping over the chickens or her own skirt. Nothing came easy on a ranch. Her hands blistered from pumping water. Her legs ached from stooping in the garden, and she bruised her thumb trying to split firewood. Maisie was sick for 2 more days. Barbara read to her each afternoon from an old Bible she found, not for the verses, but for the rhythm of the words. Maisie would listen with heavy-lidded eyes, clutching Barbara's sleeve, her thumb in her mouth. Thomas remained a silence. He came and went with the sun. He never asked Barbara to stay longer. He never said thank you. He only spoke to give instructions. Boil the water, watch the stove, more hay. And he never used her name. But she could feel his eyes on her. Not openly, but when she sewed a patch on Maisie's nightshirt, she felt his gaze linger. When she stirred the broth, he would glance at the bowl before passing by. And when Maisie was unexpectedly sick, he brought the basin, set it on the floor, and walked out. On the 3rd night, Barbara fell asleep at the kitchen table. She'd been mending socks, Maisie's and Thomas's, thick and grimy, when her eyelids grew too heavy. The candle had burned low, casting a soft, golden glow on her cheek. Thomas came in from the barn, smelling of hay and cold air. He stopped in the doorway, watched her for a long moment, then moved silently. He took the blanket from the rocking chair and draped it over her shoulders. His hand hovered near her hair, then retreated. He blew out the candle, letting the firelight do the rest. He said nothing, but at the threshold, he paused and looked back. His expression was unreadable. his eyes darker than the night, and for the first time, not empty. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he thought he would never see again. Something soft, something good. Barbara stirred in her sleep, but didn't wake. She breathed slowly, as if the weight of the blanket had given her permission to rest. And for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Dustmere didn't feel like a mistake. Not because of the man, but because of the child who clung to her without question, and the quiet way that child's father had begun to let his grief crack open, just enough to let in a sliver of warmth, just enough to let her stay. Barbara rose before the sun each morning. She had grown used to the groans of the old floorboards, the smell of dust and wood. In the gray, silent dawn, she moved through the house like a breath through cloth, careful, unnoticed, necessary. She fed the stove, boiled the oatmeal, reheated the broth Thomas left to simmer. Maisie, still half asleep with tangled curls, would wander in and curl up at the table without a word. Barbara never had to ask. She would braid the girl's hair, wipe her mouth, mend the fraying hem of her sleeve. Thomas never said thank you. He would nod once, eat in silence, then head for the fields, his boots thudding heavily on the porch. Sometimes, he'd pause by the edge of the barn as if he meant to turn back, but he never did. By the second week, he no longer stopped her from joining him outside. He would hand her a basket, gesture toward the garden, let her carry buckets of feed. He showed her which hen was a pecker and which cow had a lame leg, but he kept his distance. They worked in a rhythm, not together. If he spoke, it was to explain a task. If she laughed when a goat nibbled her skirt, or when Maisie tried to ride the farm dog, Thomas would look away, as if the sound were a language he had forgotten. In town, the whispers followed her. "She's the third one," Barbara heard in the general store. "Pretty, too. Heard the last girl cried herself sick." She smiled at the clerk, ignoring them. She had weathered worse than gossip. But that night, as she folded Maisie's nightshirt, the weight of those words settled deep in her chest. She wasn't his wife. She didn't belong here. One afternoon, while collecting eggs, she caught a moment between father and daughter. Maisie was dozing on the porch swing, her thumb near her mouth. Thomas, mending a shutter, froze when he heard her murmur, "Mama." Maisie sighed in her sleep. Barbara went still. Thomas stood motionless, then lowered his tool and went inside without a word. That night, he didn't speak through dinner. Barbara tried to meet his gaze, but he kept his eyes on his plate. After the dishes were done, Barbara sat by the window. The silence stretched between them like an untold story. She couldn't blame him, but she couldn't stay, not as something she was not. She packed her things in the dark, left her borrowed boots by the door, and folded her apron, placing a note beside it. "Thank you for the shelter." She lay on the cot, listening to the wind. In the morning she rose early, but stopped in the kitchen. Thomas was already there. He stood at the stove spooning porridge into a bowl, while holding Maisie on his hip. The girl was clinging to him, flushed and half awake. Barbara blinked. He didn't look up. "Thought you'd be gone," he said. "I still can be." Thomas set the bowl down, then walked to her chair and placed something on it. Her shawl, the blue one she wrapped around herself each morning. Not on the bench, not on a stool, but on her chair. Then he picked up the spoon and stirred the porridge. Barbara moved closer, her fingers brushing the shawl. Thomas didn't meet her eyes. "Maisie likes your stories." "And you?" she asked softly. "I like that she smiles." Barbara sat. Her hands were trembling, and not from the cold. "I didn't ask you to stay," he said, his back still to her. "You didn't know how." And that was the first truth they had ever shared. It wasn't love, not yet, but something simpler. The beginning of a place claimed not by duty or by chance, but by choice. It was nearly dusk when Barbara opened the wrong drawer. She was looking for a clean towel. Maisie had spilled honey on her dress at dinner, and Barbara had rushed to the sink to get the stain out before it set. The linen drawer by the hearth, she thought. That's where Thomas kept dishcloths and mending kits. But instead, beneath a layer of neatly folded rags, her fingers touched wood. She pulled it out. A small, worn box, the hinges slightly rusted, the corners scuffed with time. She shouldn't have opened it, but her hands acted before her conscience could catch up. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Some folded, some crumpled, some unfinished. Letters, all addressed in the same careful, looping script. To my Mary. Barbara caught her breath. She didn't read them all. She only unfolded the one on top. The page was yellowed at the edges, the ink smudged in one corner. It was dated nearly 5 years ago, but the grief in the words felt fresh. "I do not know how to live without you," it read, "but I am learning for her. She has your eyes when she laughs, and my silence when she does not. I don't know if this is a blessing or a curse." The letter ended there. No signature, no closing. Just a final, solitary line written in a smaller hand than the rest. "I hate the mornings most. That's when you should be here." Barbara folded it carefully, her fingers trembling. She was still holding the wooden box when Thomas came through the door. He stopped short, his boots caked in mud, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder. His eyes flickered from the open drawer to the box in her hands. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, his voice came out low and sharp. "That is not yours." Barbara nodded. "I know. You had no right." "It wasn't my intention," she said softly. "I was just—" Maisie spilled something. "I was trying to help." He took a step forward, his eyes darkening. "I don't need help with this." Barbara didn't move. "I wasn't trying to fix anything." He stood there, his breathing heavy. "You don't know what it's like," he said suddenly, his voice tight with a pain he could no longer contain. "To lose your entire world in a single night. To watch the only woman who ever truly saw you bleed out with your child in her arms. And then to look at that child's face every day and pretend you don't want to fall apart." His voice broke on the last word. Barbara's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't blink them away, didn't reach for him, didn't step back. "I'm not here to replace her," she said, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm of his grief. "I'm just here to be present." Thomas looked away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment she thought he would retreat into that familiar silence, but instead he whispered, "I wrote to her, every week after she was gone." Barbara didn't speak. She knew this was a space she could not interrupt. "I'd sit in the barn and write as if she were still out there somewhere, waiting in a place I could reach." He paused. "I never mailed any of them." "She would have read them anyway," Barbara said gently. He looked up then, meeting her gaze. "She seemed like someone worth loving," she added. "She was," he said, his voice raw. "She still is." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the house, rattling a loose shutter. The fire crackled in the hearth behind them. Then, from the back room, Maisie called out in her sleep, a soft, breathless, "Mama." Neither of them moved at first. Then, with a long exhale, Thomas walked over and carefully closed the lid of the box. His hands hovered over it for a second longer than necessary. He didn't put it back in the drawer. He set it on the table. "I should have burned them," he murmured. "You should let someone read them," Barbara said. He turned to her. "Why you?" "I didn't choose this," she said. "But I won't turn away." For the first time, something in his expression shifted. It didn't soften exactly. It cracked. A layer peeled back, and beneath it was not warmth or affection, but something raw. Loneliness. The kind that had built walls so high he'd forgotten how to see over them. He gave her a long, unreadable look. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room. Barbara stood alone in the kitchen, the words from the letter still etched in her mind. Another line echoed, this one unfinished. "I am learning because of her." She hung the dish towel on the back of the chair and picked up Maisie's mended dress. Silently, Barbara packed her bag. There wasn't much to take. A few dresses, a hairbrush, a worn book of poems she'd brought from the city. Her shoes were dusty and beyond repair. Her gloves had holes in the fingertips. She folded everything carefully, as if the neatness could make the leaving easier. She did not cry. The sun had not yet risen. The sky outside the small cabin was a faint, bruised lavender, streaked with the first hints of gold. The house was silent. Even the chickens had yet to begin their morning calls. In the corner of the room, Maisie slept curled under the quilt, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something in her dreams. Barbara watched her for a long time. Then she turned, picked up her bag, and went to the kitchen. Thomas was already there, standing by the stove, pouring water into the kettle. He didn't look at her. Barbara cleared her throat. "I'm leaving this morning." He nodded, not turning. She waited, hoping for a word, a question, anything. But the silence held. So she said, her voice steady, "I think I've stayed longer than I should have. Maisie is stronger now. You're both better." Still, he said nothing. Her heart ached, but she managed a small smile. "Thank you for letting me stay." He finally looked at her then. His eyes were unreadable. Not cold, but distant, as if he had already braced himself for her absence. "I'll tell her you said goodbye," he said. "No," Barbara replied. "I want to do it myself." When Maisie woke, Barbara was kneeling by her bed. The little girl blinked, sleepy and soft, and then her eyes fell on the bag. "No," Maisie whispered. Barbara smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead. "I have to go, sweet girl." Maisie sat up, her lower lip trembling. "But why?" Barbara couldn't find the words. Instead, she pulled the small girl into a hug. "You're going to be all right. Your father loves you so much." Maisie clung to her tighter. "But I love you too." Barbara's eyes filled. She blinked the tears back fiercely. "I know. I love you too." The child's small hands fisted in the fabric of Barbara's skirt. "Please don't go." Barbara kissed her cheek. "You are so brave, Maisie, and so kind. You'll always have a piece of me." even when I'm not here." She gently stood, prying the child's fingers from her dress. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Thomas stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. Barbara walked past him and out into the cold morning air. She walked slowly down the path, bag in hand, her spine straight, though every step felt like it might break her. Behind her, the cabin door closed, and then came the sound. A high, piercing, raw scream. "She's my mother now!" Barbara stopped dead in the path. Maisie's voice was not a tantrum. It was pure heartbreak. Barbara's hand tightened on the handle of her bag. Thunderous footsteps pounded behind her. She turned just as Thomas burst from the door, Maisie struggling in his arms. The little girl's face was red and wet with tears, her hands still reaching for Barbara. He caught up to her, his chest heaving. He didn't look like the man she had met weeks ago, the man who spoke in clipped sentences and wore his grief like armor. He looked like a father who had already lost too much and could not bear to lose anything more. "She isn't the only one who doesn't want you to go," he said, his voice hoarse. Barbara just looked at him, and he held her gaze. I don't know what this is between us. I just know it aches when you're not here." Maisie clung to his shirt, sobbing. Barbara reached out, her hand stroking the child's hair. Then she looked at Thomas. "I don't need promises," she said softly. "Good," he rasped. "I don't have any to give, only reasons to ask you to stay." Barbara let the bag fall from her hand. And when she stepped forward, she wasn't just stepping toward him. She was stepping toward them. The storm came without warning. Wind howled across the fields, snapping branches and rattling the windows. Rain hammered the cabin roof like fists. Inside, Thomas moved quickly, securing the shutters, while Barbara held Maisie close, humming softly to soothe the little girl's frayed nerves. A flash of lightning bleached the sky. Then came the sound. Not thunder, but a sickening, unmistakable crack, followed by a deep, echoing roar. Barbara's head snapped toward the window. A red glow lit the night just over the ridge. "The barn," she whispered. Before Thomas could react, Barbara had thrown her shawl over her head and was out the door. "Barbara!" But she was already gone. Mud splattered her skirt as she ran across the yard. The barn loomed ahead, its roof already licked by flames, smoke pluming into the churning sky. Sparks danced on the wind, threatening the nearby woodshed. She stopped short, grabbing a bucket and fumbling for the water trough. Thomas reached her seconds later, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you mad?" "There's no time!" she shouted over the storm. "The horse is still inside!" Without waiting, she ran for the barn doors, heaving them open against a blast of smoke and heat. The air is thick, suffocating. Fire ate at the rafters above. Inside, the horse screamed, trapped behind a fallen beam. Thomas was at her side in an instant. "Get the beam," he yelled. Barbara didn't hesitate. Together, they heaved at the smoldering timber, muscles screaming, lungs burning, faces streaked with soot. The horse bolted as the path cleared, nearly trampling Barbara in its panic. "Get out! Go!" Thomas urged, slapping the horse's flank. Barbara stumbled back outside, gasping for air as the horse galloped toward the open pasture. Saved. The barn, however, groaned ominously. "It's going!" Thomas yelled, but Barbara was already hauling more buckets. "We can stop it from spreading." He cursed under his breath, but joined her. They worked through the worst of the storm, drenched and covered in ash. By the time the last embers hissed into the mud, the sky to the east was beginning to lighten. Barbara sank to her knees, exhausted. Thomas knelt beside her. "Let me see your hands." She didn't argue. Her palms were raw and red with blisters where the rough bucket handles and the heat had seared her skin. Thomas took them gently, holding them as if they were something fragile. "You're burned," he said, his voice low. "I'll live. You shouldn't have gone in there alone. You would have done the same." He looked up, his eyes finding hers. "Yes," he admitted, "but I've already lost too much. I couldn't bear it." He stopped, the unspoken words hanging in the air. The wind tugged at her hair, now matted with rain and soot. Her chest ached, but not from the exertion. Thomas pulled a clean cloth from his coat pocket and, with practiced care, wrapped it around one of her hands. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was impossibly gentle. He took her other hand, holding it for a moment longer before binding it as well. His hands did not let go. Barbara held her breath, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. In the quiet, smoky ruins of the morning, something had passed between them. An understanding, a bond forged in fire. Thomas looked down at her hands in his. "You stayed," he murmured, the words almost lost to the wind. Barbara looked up. "What?" "You stayed," he repeated, his voice clearer this time, "when anyone else would have run." Barbara didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly against his. Her eyes closed. They stayed like that, suspended in a fragile, perfect moment, as the world slowly came back to life around them. Soon, Maisie's laughter would fill the yard. The chores would pile up again. The gossip of the town would find its way back to them. But for now, the only truth that mattered was two people, still kneeling on the wet earth, not needing to say what they both already knew. The kitchen smelled of fresh cornbread and pine oil. Barbara noticed it the moment she stepped onto the porch. The table had been cleared, scrubbed to a shine, and in its center sat a single oil lamp, casting a soft amber glow over 2 plates and 3 cups. Maisie stood beside the table, her dress a little too neat for an ordinary evening, her curls combed carefully behind her ears. Barbara blinked, taken by surprise. "What is all this?" Maisie beamed. "It's a surprise." Before Barbara could say more, Thomas emerged from the hallway. He'd changed his shirt. The collar was slightly crooked, but his hair was combed, and he held himself differently. Still cautious, but with a new resolve. He cleared his throat. "We thought we owed you a proper dinner, for everything." Barbara's heart gave a little leap. They sat together at the table, the 3 of them. Maisie chattered between bites of cornbread and spoonfuls of beans. Thomas ate in silence, but his gaze kept drifting to Barbara before quickly looking away. Once the dishes were cleared, Maisie scurried to the fireplace and retrieved something from behind the lantern. She returned with both hands cupped, as if holding a precious secret. "I have something for you," she said, her eyes wide. Barbara knelt. "You do?" Maisie nodded solemnly and placed a small, hand-carved wooden ring into Barbara's palm. "Papa made it for you." Barbara stared, her breath caught in her throat. The ring was simple, smoothed by careful sanding, the grain of the wood warm beneath her fingers. When she looked up, Thomas had moved closer. "I know it isn't much," he said, his voice low and steady, but I wanted you to have something made by my own hands. Barbara rose slowly to her feet. Thomas met her gaze. It was never about you waiting at the station, he said. It was about you arriving here. Barbara's lips trembled. He reached out and took her hand gently. I know I don't come easy. I don't come with a house full of laughter or pleasant memories. I come with scars, with silence, with a little girl who needs more than I've ever known how to give. Maisie climbed onto a nearby chair, watching with bated breath. Thomas took a deep breath. But I also come with a promise. A promise that I will spend every single day learning how to deserve the kindness you've already shown us. Barbara's eyes glistened. He brought her hand to his chest, where his heart beat steady and strong beneath her fingertips. Will you marry not just me, but us? For a moment, Barbara could only look at him, the man who once said nothing, felt nothing, and opened himself to no one. Now he was asking for everything. Tears streamed down her cheeks before she could stop them. She pressed her forehead against his. Yes, she whispered. Maisie clapped, hopping down from her chair. She said yes. Barbara laughed through her tears, and Thomas smiled. A real smile, quiet and complete. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It didn't shine, it didn't gleam, but it fit. And in the soft lantern light, surrounded by nothing but shared silence and Maisie's giggles, their future began. Not grand, not loud, but steady and true. 1 year later, the Callahan Ranch no longer echoed with silence. Laughter filled its hallways. Maisie's high-pitched giggles chased Barbara's footsteps, and Thomas's low humming could be heard as he worked outside. The shutters were now kept open, letting the morning light spill in. A flower box bloomed on the windowsill, stubbornly bright against the dusty backdrop. Barbara moved through the kitchen with an easy grace, flipping pancakes in a skillet, while Maisie sat at the table, drawing with a piece of charcoal. Thomas came in with an armful of firewood, pausing just long enough to kiss Barbara's cheek, an act so natural now, it almost startled her when she remembered the man he used to be. After breakfast, while Maisie played in the dirt outside with her wooden dolls, Thomas stood by the fireplace, looking up at the empty frame that had hung there for years. The old photograph inside it had long since faded, and the cracked glass had been removed. He turned slowly to Barbara, a thoughtful crease in his brow. I was thinking, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe it's time we put something new in that frame. Barbara set down her dish towel. You want to hang a picture? He nodded. A real picture of us. The kind she'll never have to wait to be a part of. Barbara smiled softly. Are you so sure? She's already in it, he said, glancing out the window at Maisie, who was crouched by the chicken coop. It's just time the world saw it, too. A week later, they went to town in their cleanest clothes. Barbara wore the blue dress Thomas always said matched the Dustmere sky. Maisie had ribbons in her hair and a smudge on her nose that she refused to let them wipe away. Thomas wore a crisp, freshly washed white shirt, tucked awkwardly into his best trousers. At the photographer's studio, the man adjusted the light, positioned them just so, and began to count down slowly. Thomas held Barbara's hand. Maisie sat on her father's lap, one arm looped around Barbara's shoulder. Now hold still, the photographer said. They did. And when the shutter clicked, something settled. The photograph arrived a week later, wrapped in brown paper. Barbara opened it gently, her fingers trembling as she brought it into the light. There they were. 3 people, a family. No one was waiting. That night, after Maisie had gone to bed, Barbara sat by the fire and took out the old wooden box, the box of Thomas's unscented letters. She opened it slowly, taking out a few of the faded pages. Then, carefully, she placed the photograph in the box beside them. Next, she took a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Dear Barbara, you thought you were forgotten. You thought your name would never be called, that your place in this world had passed you by on the station platform. But you were not forgotten. You were being sent, guided, perhaps not to the man you expected, but to the life you needed. To a little girl who had a space in her heart only you could fill. To a man who had stopped believing anyone would ever stay. To a ranch that didn't need saving, but healing. You were not a mistake in a contract. You were the answer to a question not yet asked. And now, you are not waiting. You are home. She signed it simply, Barbara Callahan. When Thomas joined her on the porch later, he handed her a mug of warm cider and sat beside her in silence. The stars blinked overhead, the wind a soft whisper against the grass. She's sleeping with the photo under her pillow, he said, smiling faintly. Barbara leaned her head against his shoulder. They stayed that way for a long time. The kind of silence that no longer held pain, only peace. Thomas turned to her. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that letter had gone to the right man? Barbara laughed softly. I wonder what would have happened if that little girl hadn't come to me with those giant boots. He kissed her temple. The smart one of the bunch. She nodded. And the best matchmaker I've ever met. They both laughed then, a warm, honest sound. And in that laughter, the very last trace of loneliness faded into memory. The porch light stayed on a little longer that night, just long enough to say, no one here waits alone. Not anymore. Thank you for watching. She waited 3 days at the station, a story of unexpected love and of finding a home where you least expect it. If you believe in slow-burn Western romances, be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. New, heartwarming tales every week, only on this channel. Like, share, and get ready for the next story.